Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting, and remember last time we had to rush to get ready to finish and so on. So again, I'll remind you, questions, please think about questions or comments, and then at 3 o'clock we will have Tanya and Amanda up here, and also Paulina will come back at 3 o'clock. So I would now like you to give your attention to Tanya Sawicka-Mead, or Sawicki as they say in New Zealand. Sawicki or Sawicki? Sawicki. So I'm not sure, I think it was Nina, your mum, who found us and who said, oh, you might be interested in my daughter's story about the stuff that she did, and we made the connection that way, so it's fantastic, and here you are in Poland. So welcome, Kiwis. Always good to have Kiwis representing at the conference. So without any further introduction, I'll pass on to Tanya, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone, dzień dobry. Thanks for having me today and for the hospitality. Thanks to all our speakers who've gone before. It's been extremely interesting for us coming all the way from New Zealand and not being super well connected to the rest of the Polish diaspora, although we've met some others here from Wellington already, which is quite strange to come all the way to Warsaw to meet people from Wellington. Yeah, but I guess this is an opportunity for us to begin our journey that many of you have already started on, and tracing the journeys of your families, in some cases yourselves, to where you are today. So I'm Tanya. I'm a first-generation New Zealander, and I trace my Polish back to Kredzi on my mother's side. I'm a very recent and very much beginner student of Polish history, so I want to preface the talk that I'm about to give today by acknowledging my more or less total ignorance of the wider context of the story that I'm about to tell you. My talk today is based on quite a short paper that I wrote about 3 years ago when my late grandfather, Stanislaw Sawicki, his memoirs resurfaced in our family. We'd known for a long time that they existed, but they weren't in a format that we could read. And then they it transpired that we were able to read them. And at the time, I was studying for my master's in Canada, and a very generous professor gave me permission to write about this very personal story as part of a paper on the politics of witnessing. And really that was about the politics of witnessing trauma, of witnessing war, of witnessing hardship. In this paper I was interested in understanding more what my grandfather went through as one of the many hundreds of thousands who were displaced from Kredzi, what he remembered and what he felt, how he felt as a witness to some of those great atrocities of the 20th century, particularly as the story is not very well known in New Zealand, to my knowledge. As I mentioned, it's a very specific and personal story. It doesn't really begin to cover the full complexity of the Kredzi experience, and it doesn't try to draw any large conclusions other than to perhaps offer some questions about what this means and how my grandfather felt. I focused in this paper on his experience primarily in his journey to the Gulag, rather than the story that followed of the diaspora, which is a story for another time, I hope. Just a fair warning as well at this point that my grandfather was very loquacious. His stories are quite detailed, and it's sometimes a little heavy, so I apologise for it not being for it not necessarily being particularly easy to understand. So this is my grandfather and me in 1991 in Waikanai, and really this is the beginning of his story. At the beginning of his memoirs he says, "For some years I wished to write a narrative of my life to preserve the experience of living, sometimes just surviving at different points on the globe. My narrative, I hope, bears witness to my affection for my ancestors, to whom I owe much, and also faithfully records what I have lived through, what I saw and what I heard. Nowadays, much is said about history, but unless we relate it to ourselves personally, history remains an abstraction, with general forces and ideas obscuring individual details. It is a rare and privileged thing to be able to tell your story and to be heard. My grandfather, Stanislaw Sawicki, was for a long time not someone that you might consider to be privileged. He was born in a contested border zone between Poland and Belarus during the tectonic shifts of Eastern European politics in the 1920s. His long journey to New Zealand, where I was born, took him to a Soviet labor camp in Siberia, through the Mongolian steppe to Persia, to England and the Antipodes, and back again. When he finally settled in the sleepy retirement town of Waikanai, New Zealand, in the early 1990s, He finally had the psychic and material resources to sit down and record his story, or rather the bits of it that he wished to tell. This paper is my brief attempt to engage with my grandfather's testimony and to better understand his role as a witness to some of the great horrors of the 20th century, but also to understand who he was as a person beyond the stories that have been passed down to me in family lore. Interpretation is not easy, particularly when age, cultural context, language, and space divide you from your subject. My grandfather died when I was 6 years old, and we were very close during the short period in which we both lived on this earth. But I remember very little of our conversations, or really what he was like. Vague impressions, coupled with the brief stories from my family, photos and letters that we have, are all that remain. The memoirs that Stan more or less completed not long before his very sudden death are complex. They're poetic, dense, insightful, funny, not always intentionally, and at times kind of torturous. They speak of a man who was haunted by the loss of his country and yet only once came back, who mourned the scattering of his family to the ends of the earth and yet at the same time wrote that the past was useless to me, let the past bury dead bodies. So, why did he write this? Stan writes in the beginning of his memoirs, "In 1991, after many years' delay, I began to write my story in Waikanae, New Zealand. Two events brought my attention to life. Teresa, my eldest daughter, my mother's sister, became interested in the country of my youth as a result of her scholarly pursuits, and once casually remarked, 'We don't know much about you, other than the place you were born.' The other event was the entry into my life of my eldest granddaughter, Tanya, who with her vivid child's imagination became curious about life on Grandpa's farm in Poland. Over and over again, she heard my story with its colourful touching up of that faraway country." The story really begins with the birth of my grandfather in 1919 in the Polish village of Pochost in Commune Dolchino, rural district Wielka and County Wilno, as he records it. He begins his story by lamenting the fact that despite a very long ancestral history in the area, no family that he knows of still remain. Poverty, deportations, war, the oppressive reign of successive governments, and the pull of a better life have all contributed to the dispersal of those who once called Pochost home. The Saviskis have been scattered across Europe and Australasia thanks to the family Via Dolorosa, and would likely find themselves on the opposite side of any future war, wearing different uniforms, serving under different colours, and owing allegiance to different political masters. There are fading family photographs which do remain, but Stan, my grandfather, thinks of himself as the only remaining link between the generations before and those who remain, and believes that even if the photos could speak, we wouldn't comprehend their voices. This record thus takes on even greater burden of historical memory. The records of Stan's early life in Pochost are uncannily detailed. For someone who's lived in at least 5 different countries and only once returned to the place of his birth, it is strange how easily he evokes the sensations of life in a rural Polish village. It's a story guided by the rhythms of agricultural life, by the demands of each distinct season, by the rituals of Eastern Catholicism, and by the tragedies and accidents of precarious lives. Despite this relative stability, murmurs of the cataclysms that would shape Stan's life could be sensed at the corners of the stories that he recounts in these chapters. His maternal aunt and her husband were shot one August morning while gathering mushrooms. Stan escaped a similar fate by being delayed from that same mission by a friend who could not tie his shoelaces in the pre-dawn gloom. No formal inquiry or account of their death was ever given. Later that year, a group of small boys throwing snowballs at each other came across a grenade, and inevitable tragedy ensued. Again, Stan escaped by chance or fate. He later came to see a divine hand in this and many other tales of survival against the odds, particularly given their proximity to, as he says, liturgical days of significance. This ability to seek the will of God in the darkest of tales has, to my knowledge, skipped all subsequent generations. Pochost was beset by these tragedies, however small in the wider Polish perspective, in part because of its close proximity to the Russian border. As the tendrils of state control grew stronger and extended further, the borderlands became increasingly precarious for people living on both sides. Over time, the securitization of this border made each country virtually a different world, as the Soviet state sought to more firmly establish its control over all aspects of social and economic life. Stan talks about refugees whose familial connections to Poland made them suspect and who would flee across the border under the cover of night or under haystacks during harvest. He says that they all had the same story to tell. The special shock troops pulverized opposition to the regime. They atomized society and they completed collectivization on Moscow's order. Moscow, they said, does not believe in tears. It seems inevitable now, looking back, that this tenuous peace was shortly about to be broken. It was simply a matter of how and when. Yet for Stan, in February 1939, everything was as it should be. He says, "It never entered my head that someone from the outside world would simply slip these people into a chasm and bury them and their traditions." Sorry. They came for Stan just as they came for others, brazen in the early dawn of April 13th, 1940. There had already been mass deportations from eastern Poland, from Krzycz, some weeks earlier, and rumours had spread about the final destination of the trains and trucks and the horrors of this journey. In a brief, opportune moment, Stan kicked a dusty board out of the attic, through the roof, jumped into the snow, and ran for the forest, into the relative safety of Poznakia, some 4 kilometres away. His escape was short-lived. Fearing that those who sheltered him would be punished if he was found, he first made his way to Lithuania, where he found a border as militarized as the one that he was attempting to escape. Turning instead to Hungary, he traveled by train, truck, and foot through Soviet-occupied Poland, feeling all the time like, he says, an immobilized, skittish human animal cut off from all possibilities of escape. His interception before the border by a Highlander actually helped to ensure his survival, as it may have turned out, as Poles caught fleeing the Soviet-occupied border were tried as counter-revolutionaries and spies. At the time, however, that knowledge was of no comfort. Confronting the faceless and bureaucratic evil of the NKVD, Stan tore up any remaining markers of his true identity and answered all questions about himself with the following: surname, Polansky; name, Alexander; patrimonik, Josefowicz. He talks about the moment when he is sent to the camps. 3 uniformed men were seated at the table. I stood in silence. The man in the centre asked my name. Then he read loudly that I was charged under the criminal code of the USSR, I believe Article 57, with illegally crossing the frontier between the USSR and Germany. No one attempted to prove that I had crossed the frontier. The imputed guilt was on my admission. I was myself an unimpeachable witness to the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I don't quite know what I expected to encounter in the story of his Kafkaesque trial and the subsequent deportation to Siberia. As with the rest of his narrative, it's eerie how much detail he is able to dredge up from this distant past. And it's through this detail that the real horror of the life in the Gulag is communicated. Confinement to a camp is the first and most visible indignity. A lot has been said in subsequent years about the horrifying logic of 20th century camp life. But the frozen tundra that encircled the camp where Stan was imprisoned was a prison in and of itself. The violence of that climate replaced that of the violence of humans. In winter, frostbite and ice. In summer, a nightmarish bog world of insects and malaria. Rations were insufficient to prevent starvation, particularly when coupled with labour and thigh-high snow. And yet death was slow. It crept through tired eyes, swollen feet, and faint hearts. Above all this floated the knowledge that the Soviets effectively controlled time as well as space, for the completion of your sentence was no guarantee of your release. Ironically, or perhaps intentionally, the process of trial and punishment that Stan went through seems specifically designed to prevent the acts of witnessing and subsequent testimony that Stan and others before him managed to share, despite the trauma and in some cases the shame of survival. Prisoners were denied the privilege of being referred to by their names, preventing other prisoners from learning who they were in prison with, and ensuring that once a person was in NKVD hands, no one in the world outside or inside knew about his whereabouts or even if he was alive. A prisoner who encountered another whilst walking the corridors was forced to face the wall, lest he encountered a familiar face. But there are daily acts of resistance against this erasing force, names chiselled into bunk posts, tiny pinpricks under certain letters and books that would spell out hope for families searching for their loved ones. Having concealed his true identity, having given a false name to protect his family, Stanislav was pained by the knowledge that even if he died, he would be invisible, that a nameless set of bones would be buried in the white vastness of the Russian land that tortured him. Of course, we are lucky that Stanislav did survive to tell this tale. No small part of this survival was thanks to his ability to speak Russian, allowing him to be entrusted with certain kinds of work and subsequently larger rations. But the sense of communicability, this ability to communicate, was a small and powerful tool to wield against the edifice of violence, helping him to make sense of what was going on around him. He was also reasonably healthy and had experience with manual labour, which counted for a great deal. He learned to survive as best he could, but there was little comfort at the end of a long day when he says that violent hunger pangs kept him awake and loneliness gripped his heart. What seemed to distress him the most, almost as much, was the dehumanizing of those around him, particularly those who were dying very slowly. He says, one lesson that all prisoners in the penal labour camp learnt was that one could lead a normal life without pity. He had witnessed so many healthy people sacrifice so much to care for the sick and ailing throughout his whole life, and yet those who were crumbling themselves would avoid a helpless human body, blind or swollen, as if death itself was a contagious human condition. Stan writes, compassion towards fellow prisoners gave way to resentment towards the weakling, the infirm, and the physically disabled, because they used scarce food resources to the detriment of others. A starving person does not philosophize about the options given to him for survival, but he is ready to do everything to gain just an extra crumb of bread or a spoonful of soup. I'm reminded here of Primo Levi's contention that of the lagers, of the camps, that the worst survived, that is, the fittest, the best all died. I get this theory in theory, but it's difficult to compare this with the survival of your loved ones. Primo Levi tells us that we can't judge, that civilian moral codes can't apply in circumstances so basically deprived of a basic ethic of care. But we wonder how the lessons learnt during such experiences in the camps might come to the fore in later years, or to what extent survival is about your ability to forget. For Stan, release came finally thanks to the tireless efforts of the Polish government in exile during negotiations between Russia and the Allies. The right to walk away from the camp did not mean the right to freedom, as we've discussed a lot today. Labour scarcity and transport location meant that access to facilities and methods of transport had to be given to the Soviet army, an army to which Stan was reminded by the commandant he must be loyal to as a Soviet citizen. His journey from Siberia to the Mongolian steppe contained almost as many trials as the Gulag itself. Through this trail from one extreme end of the land to the other, Stan thought, he says, the Soviet Union was neither a state nor a country, but simply the greatest concentration camp in the world. The details therein, though, are a story for another time. He writes of finding his identity again upon release. The officers sitting across the table asked me, your surname? Savitsky. Forename? Stanislav. Date and place of birth? 3rd of October 1919, Prohost, Commune de Hinlo, district of Wilelka, County Winno. I was reborn again. And I'd just like to end with some photos of my grandfather and his brothers after he was, this is many, many years after his long journey from the Gulag through Persia into Palestine, to the UK, to Australia, then to New Zealand, back to England, and then New Zealand again. He found his family, most of whom had already relocated to France, and this is when we went back to visit them some 40 years later. So that's Stanislav with his brothers Tadek and Pierre, and then that's me, showing a lot of attitude with my grandmother, aged 5. And I wanted to share these as memories of the family connections that Stan managed to hold on to despite, the horrors of the story that I've just told you about, and to honour those family members who still remain, and who we remain very much in touch with. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya. That's brilliant, and obviously the intellectual approach to life has been passed down the generations. And thank you for bringing your mother and your sister as well to Warsaw. And I think that's the perfect transition to the next speaker, who is also from far away, from Canada. Amanda, will you come up? Because I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing you because, well, first of all, a lot of people already know you, and you've met a lot of Sibiraks in a lot of countries along the way, and we'd like to hear you talk rather than me. So I'll very quickly pass.
Are they watching, by the way? Is there...
It's on the internet.
It is being streamed, okay.
It's being live streamed,
okay,
and then it'll be
great.
podcast later, so...
Okay, because following with what you just said, I'd like to say, hi, everyone. Oh, there, okay. Because I do believe that there are some people that I was in contact with who said, sorry, we won't be able to see you live, but we will see you online. So thank you so much for having me. I would just like to take a quick moment to thank the Kresy Siberia Foundation for the very generous invitation, and to thank the government of Poland. Actually, the Polish consul in Montreal helped to facilitate the trip for Jonathan and I to be here with you today. So thank you. Looking over the Facebook page of the Kresy Siberia group for the last few years, there's been a lot of conversation going on regarding resilience, post-traumatic stress disorder, responses to trauma, the good, the bad, the different dimensions of it. So today I'm going to touch on the topic of Siberak resilience and the role played by their refugee camps. Okay. But just before we begin, I'd like to ask from the people who are here, who was in one of the refugee camps? Personally, okay? Yeah? Yeah, anywhere in the, so I should say, when I say refugee, I mean resettlement camp, refugee camp, any sort of site of displacement rather than going directly back to Poland, okay? How about people who had a parent or a grandparent who were, okay, so there we go. So some of you may have heard some of these stories before, but again, one of the ways of coping sometimes is not to talk about experiences that we've had. Just a quick note on time, thank you. A quick note on time as well. I'm going to try to keep this brief, so there will definitely be unanswered questions and topics that aren't going to be developed as much as they could be. I'm happy to talk more about this after the presentation and to be able to go into more detail. And again, just before we begin, I'd like to nuance 3 different terms. Resilience is a term that's used a lot. This is a resilient table. If I apply a force to it, it's either unchanged or it goes back to how it was before. If this microphone, a force is applied to it, it's moved back and forth, that makes it resilient. The definition of resilience in an individual context is if something is applied to the person, so let's say they go through a traumatic experience, they bounce back in a way. That's what, by definition, makes them resilient. But there are different types of post-traumatic responses. That's just one of them. Another is anything that is post-traumatic stress related. So that would be not necessarily a disorder, which really requires a clinical diagnosis, but any sort of we could say more negative reactions, some of the ones that we are familiar with. But one area that's been largely overlooked is post-traumatic growth, which is the idea that going through a traumatic experience actually helps you grow as a person in some way. Now, to say that someone goes through post-traumatic stress and or post-traumatic growth doesn't undermine the experience that they have. And it's not better or worse to go through either of those or anywhere on the spectrum. The reality is that everyone goes through some of those elements in different ways. And through this presentation, I'd like to illuminate some of those different ways. To begin, I'll set out this quote. The context of recall of the past is determined by one's life history as well as one's current life circumstances. The present, so this moment, is a filter through which life is understood, interpreted, and constructed. So to speak to that, I'm just going to tell you briefly about my life history and what my present is being with you here today. So my father's parents had been deported from Eastern Poland to Siberia when they were children. they eventually ended up in northern Rhodesia, so in Zambia, and in Tanganyika, in Tengeru, Tanzania. On my mother's side, she was born in the southeast of Poland and came to Canada in 1981, so had her own departure sort of experience from Poland. And talking about history and Polish history was always present in my home. I was raised speaking English and French. Polish is something that sort of came up between the lines, or when I would go visit Babcia and Jaja from time to time. But I had a rather Montreal or Canadian kind of experience growing up. And what that meant is that when I would go to school and I would talk about my family's history, in elementary school, in high school, CJEP, and even into university, I would encounter people telling me that they didn't know what I was talking about, that they were experts in the field, and if they didn't know about it, then it probably didn't happen. Similarly to what Jonathan had mentioned in the film yesterday, that I should check my sources. And so I ended up doing that in a slightly different way, not through filmmaking, but through research. So I found myself traveling around the world, going to archives, meeting with people, doing individual interviews, but also attending a really unique kind of event that people wouldn't really think about, and really is rather unbelievable when you think about it: refugee camp reunions. So I started attending gatherings where, I just noticed that this was not on the right page, sorry. I started attending reunions where people would gather to celebrate the time they had spent in a refugee camp. What does this mean? They would share photos, they would sing songs, they wrote songs that they then sang commemorating their experiences. And it just wasn't the way I was seeing refugee camps represented on TV. And if we think about the current refugee and migration crisis that's going on, it's not going to look like some of the images that I'm going to show you shortly. So I found myself asking, why are these places remembered so positively? And why doesn't anyone seem to know about them? So I'm not going to go in detail about what I'm about to show you, but it's just to show the immense amount of data that I've collected over the last decade or so. So again, apologies, I'm trying to coordinate a PowerPoint here and there at the same time. So this is the material that I have just related to the people who had been in refugee camps in Africa. So we have qualitative material, ethnographic material, archival material, private collections, publications, and films. This is from New Zealand. This is from India. This is from Iran. And this is overall. So there's a lot of stuff. And I've used this for my master's degree and now into my PhD. I'm finishing up my third year, and there's no way that I'm going to be able to evaluate all of it. So if anyone is looking to join some research projects, please, I need research assistance. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the refugee camps. So each of these dots, you may recognize it because it's borrowed from Jonathan's film. Each of these represents a different refugee camp, and in red you see the pre-war borders of Poland. I'm not going to go into describing the whole historical context because I believe through the previous presentations and just our knowledge of the topic that many of this is clear to you, but I would like to highlight on the right side that schools and social activities were very common in many of these refugee camp settings, as well as basic food, housing, local newspapers, publications, a sense of presence, religious institutions. So it was sort of becoming like a normal kind of life. Here I just circled the regions where I've been working and where I've visited. So it's not everywhere, but it's covering a fair bit of ground. And you can see, who here recognizes this image? So this is a map of the Tengeru camp. And when I've attended the reunions of the Afrikanische, many of them have a copy of this. So you have Mount Meru, and then indications of the different elements of everyday life that were there. So you have the school, the hospital, etc. We've already seen some of these. These are lyrics from one of the one of the reunion songs. So there's a group based in Wrocław, which was only allowed to be founded in 1989, I should note, after the eventual fall of communism. And you'll read here, Pod baobabem spotkasz znów, miły przyjaciół z tamtych dni. We meet again under the baobab tree, our dear old friends from long ago. This is the slogan of this group of Syberacy who had ended up in refugee camps in Africa and then later created an organization where they would get together to remember and celebrate the experiences they had had. Here are some more words from another song. Afrykańska zgrana klika, zawsze młoda, roześmiana. Myśli ktoś, że mamy bzika, bo śpiewamy już od rana. The African gang stands united, always young and always smiling. One might think that we have lost it, for we've been singing since the morning. I mean, not something you'd hear the average refugee, get together and sing about. Or even when we talk about the Siberia experience, obviously not in any way reflective of what they would have experienced in the gulags, there's a very distinctive joyfulness to these sorts of lyrics. Speaking to the everyday experiences of being in Africa, and I should note here as well that when I say Africa, I know that Africa is not a country. Africa, the continent, sort of like what was mentioned in Jonathan's film, Africa represents for this group of people the experiences of being in any of these refugee camps. And many people would move between the different camps as they would close and eventually group around a particular strong group, for example, Tengeru, which had 5,000 to 6,000 people in it. So, Africa. Well, our huts were usually twigs and covered with mud, and in our place it was straw on the roof, no ceiling, so things could be coming down. We had nets to keep us out of reach of whatever was coming down, and also the mosquitoes. But you see, there again, you had no running water, you had no electricity, but you can do something about it. You could make a mat out of whatever. It was just dirt, that floor. You could embroider something. You could grow papayas or bananas, something like that. It was beginning to be a normal kind of life. So again, speaking to what was the role of these refugee camps in the healing and growth of these children. It was heavens above what we had in our way, in tents and so on. And because we were young then, it was kind of adventure as well, because it was no longer hunger, it was no longer persecution. We were all in the same group. We were all kind of friends together. So when people from Africa get together, we always treat each other as we are all friends, like family. Now, of course, it also needs to be noted that not everyone had great experiences in the refugee camps in Africa. Obviously, people who didn't have good experiences don't attend the reunions. But the fact that there are people, and a pretty significant group of people, several hundred around the world, who get together to celebrate those places means there's something worth exploring there. This is a report that was written in Nairobi in 1946 by the commissioner from the East African Refugee Administration. And I'd like to just read this segment here to highlight what someone from the outside saw this refugee camp as when they visited. Due to the extreme kindness of the commissioner of EARA, I was able to visit the Polish settlement, Tengeru, together with the chief Polish educational advisor. The local camp commandant was very kind and helpful and assisted us in exploring the settlement, all the buildings, schools, hospitals, etc. Inhabitants there are happy, and I did not notice any prosecution of Jews. Interesting that they note that. There was a synagogue in Tengeru, I should note as well. I was surprised that the living conditions in the settlement are so good, houses so comfortable, and everything managed so efficiently. One matter I would like to point out, which I think is harmful to the community, this is the lack of work. And I should note this is something that is reported by refugees today as well, that I work with, that not only in the camps, but when they arrive in new countries of final resettlement, the lack of work is something that comes up as, something that hinders well-being and being able to move beyond the traumas that they had experienced. In my opinion, it is caused by very low wages, which people are paid for their work, it discourages and depresses, etc. So I'd like to move now to talk a little bit more about these reunions. But here I'll be showing more. There we go. more images. Does anyone in the room here recognize who this is? So I don't know if he's watching, but this is Kaz Majewski from Connecticut. He organizes exactly, yeah. He organizes the reunions in Connecticut, and was among the first to invite me and Jonathan as well to these reunions. And earlier this year, and I'm showing this to illustrate the friendship that is presented among this group. An email that he wrote to me titled "Africans." Dear Amanda, June 16th, 2018, we will have our Africans reunion. She'll do it again at her home in Connecticut. Let the others know, and you are welcome. Do not forget to stop at my house on Friday, June 15th, just like it was last year. Again, refugees getting together, celebrating. There's a continuity, a sense of purpose and meaning. And this is an image from one of the reunions in Connecticut. Does anyone in the room recognize who this is? So this is Father Lucian Kulikowski. Yeah. He was instrumental in helping many of the children make their way out of Africa and to North America. And on the cake it reads Jambo Rafiki, which means hello, my friend. I don't think words are needed to describe how special this connection is. And I mentioned earlier the Under the Baobab Tree Club. So this is an image from one of the reunions in 2014. You'll notice it reads Witamy Afrykańczyków, welcome Africans. And these are just a few photos from the reunions. This is a rather special set of photos. You see on the left the children dancing in a circle, and on the right is an image from the reunion when they were dancing in a circle and singing the songs of their childhood. So again, what's very interesting, this was a 4-day conference. I mean, full on. I don't know where they got this energy from. And yes, Siberia was mentioned, but usually in context as something that was difficult or negative that occurred before life then got better in Africa. They grouped themselves according to which camp they had been in, and very proudly got together with those. You'll see on the left here a map which reads Myśmy były Afrykańczycy. So we were there. There were Africans, and they went on this map and wrote down their names with where they were. And for the Tengeru group, because my grandmother had been in Tengeru, I was told, well, you're one of us, so you need to get in this photo with us as well. So there's a very nice intergenerational connection here. And I just want to briefly, again, for the sake of time, mention that similar events happen with those who were in India. So this is when I was in London. There was a reunion taking place. This is in a church basement. And is there anyone here who was in harcerstwo, in Polish Scouts? Yes. So do you remember the song where you cross your arms and you sort of sway back and forth? At the end? Exactly. So yeah. So that's exactly what we were doing there. Yeah. And then, of course, in New Zealand as well, and you may recognize someone else. Irena Lowe was very kind and hospitable when I was there and brought us on a pilgrimage with the Payatua children when I was there. So, as I had mentioned earlier, I obviously cannot go into all the results of all the research that I'm doing, but I would like to share just a handful of takeaways. But first, to begin with a 3-minute film that will illustrate and really put. I'm sorry to the translator that I'm pausing on my words here. Let's backspace a little bit. In this video, you'll see how complex the experiences are, and how when doing this sort of research, we can't just go in with a single questionnaire or one measure that we want to look at. We really need to take a holistic approach to understanding all the complexities of the experience, as well as where the individual is in the moment that they're telling their story. Now, the research that I've been doing looks at the archives, individual interviews, reunions, commemorations, and how those all interact with each other. And I think this is something that many of you will understand, and that if you start looking at what you'll read online and when you talk to people and when you look at an archive, sometimes there's information that conflicts, and that's okay. The truth is somewhere within all of that. So if we think critically and feel with great empathy these experiences, not only of the Syberace, but also of refugees and immigrants today, we'll have a deeper understanding of what it really means to be human and what connects us all. So I'll just show this brief 3-minute video and then I'll reveal the final results.
How does it make you feel that people, after everything you went through, the story isn't known?
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't blame people, because who wants to listen to sad stories? So my story is probably, you know, more private than I even didn't like to tell my son, you know, what I went through, because it's so personal. I'm telling now because I know you are doing this for the history, but it's not pleasant to remind who went through it. It's not. The Africa time, because there are people still living, you know, we went through. But Russia, I don't want to remember. I want to say, well, people behave the way they behave. And you, in any place, anytime, you see some good people. Among very bad ones, you can see still very good people. So never lose your patience and never lose ideas how to help others, because if you have no money, you can at least smile to another human being and say hello in a nice way.
Never lose your humanity.
Yeah. So if people treat each other in a nice way, it will be a much nicer place to live in this crazy world. But people have no time to each other, for each other. They push each other on computer. So computer, big deal. People look at me and say, you don't drive, you don't have computer. I said, no, I have no time for computer, and I have no time for the car because I'm going fast myself. I haven't got much regrets. To look, you know, back and so on. I think I did quite a lot, and I would like to do more. But nothing but. Because there is a lot of misery in the world. So if you can help somebody, it's much nicer than to let somebody down. So try to forget bad moments, cherish up the good ones. C'est la vie, from me.
So that was from an interview that Jonathan had done, and some of you may have recognized good old Pani Strońska, who was a real coup de force for helping us with our work and for carrying the story of the Syberace and the Afrikańczycy forward. So what contributes to resilience and growth? From the work that I've been doing, as well as coupled with research that already exists, these are the 5 points that I'd like to stress. And in this case, I'm putting up these 5 as what came up in the refugee camps that helped people to rebuild their lives. So social support and community, a stability and normal type of life, the schools, activities, and a sense of purpose and meaning. And I'd like to really underscore that 5th point of the sense of purpose and meaning, because I would argue that even if you have the other 4, if we're just sort of roaming aimlessly and not feeling like all of this has some sort of meaning, then it will be difficult to really grow and heal past the traumas that we've experienced, which makes it ultimately one of the more difficult ones to address. And something interesting that was going on in many of these refugee camps is the children had a very strong sense of purpose and meaning. They had to get better, they had to go to school, they had to take care of themselves because they were expected to then go back and rebuild Poland. So there was, and this, you know, many people didn't shy away from letting the children know you have to get better because you have this purpose. So there's something to explore there. And I'll just close on a few other findings that have come up in this research that aren't directly related to resilience, but are on the sidelines and sort of contributing factors. So the first is that there were different experiences in different contexts. So of course, we can't say that everyone in the African camps or everyone in Payatua or everyone in India had the exact same experience. In a similar vein, depending on the context of recall, different things are going to come up. For post-traumatic growth, the two main areas of change were changes in relationships. So for example, I felt like I could relate to others more, I felt like people cared about me, and changes in self. I felt like I was able to do more than I could before. Welcome practices can have a lasting effect. So for example, the children who arrived in Payatua in New Zealand, that welcome that they received, being welcomed by Prime Minister Peter Fraser, seeing the rolling hills on their way to Wellington, the kindness of the locals, receiving candy from soldiers, those are little things that might be overlooked, but for a child can really make a lasting impact when someone has gone through so much migration and trauma. And finally, how we design refugee camps has the potential to help build social networks and a sense of community. And these social networks and sense of community are critical from the work that I've been doing to help people grow and rebuild following the sort of migration. And that's all for now. Thank you.
Amanda, thank you very much. You've actually finished us ahead of schedule, so congratulations. Well, there may be time for the appendix. So if we can actually move to the discussion part, Amanda, I'll ask you to come back, and also Marcin, and also Tanya. And then I'm not sure if Paulina was going to come back. Mark, if Paulina arrives, please send her in, because we're having the question and answer session and she was going to come back, although it was at 3. No, that's for you. And well, maybe I'm going to stand over here in case. No, that's all right. Here's 3 microphones for you. So many microphones. Good. So gather your thoughts, because we have, well, about half an hour that we can use for questions, observations, reflections, maybe a bit of a discussion. And the topics are all quite different, of course, but they are all perhaps different views into the same phenomenon, looked at through different lenses. So I think it'll be interesting to get those perspectives. And from 3 people who are actually outside Poland. So with Polish roots, of course, some with stronger and more direct and others less. So I think it's going to be really an interesting discussion that we can have. And if Paulina does come, we'll ask her to, we'll bring another chair for Paulina, and she can bring the Poland perspective, of course. So there we go. Now, what we might do is I'm actually going to write down in order how I see people's hands, and then we will go through the discussion in that way. So is there anybody who has a question? And if you do, please put up your hand, and then I'll write your name. That doesn't mean you can start talking, because I'm going to collect if there's any other. I'll take 5. Maciej. Any more? Marek. Any more? Maria. My mother, of course, and Ivona, Januszaitis. Good. Well, let's close that as the first 5, and then, of course, as the discussion goes, there may be another 5 that come up. I did want to maybe just have the chair's privilege of asking a first question, though, if you don't mind. And this one picks up from the last point that, Amanda, you made, which was about sense of purpose. And I was very much thinking about, from the Australian context, how we have a group of refugees who have been placed on offshore islands. They haven't even been led into Australia. And without getting into the politics about it, it must seem very difficult for them to have a sense of purpose because they're not there to rebuild their country. They're not there to come to a new country. They're kind of adrift in an island. Australia won't even let New Zealand take them, so it's a bizarre thing. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that little piece, the sense of purpose, and how does that get built? And if you could just maybe say something about that, and then I'll ask Marcin and Tanya, maybe just from your travels and your experience to speak on that, and then we'll go to the next questions.
Sure, thank you. I will also avoid going into the politics of that because there's a lot that needs to be said. So I'll answer that from more of a child's perspective. So what will help children have that sense of purpose and meaning, right? Definitely setting out a purpose and certain tasks that are actually attainable is important for children. So rather than saying you are individually going to rebuild Poland, saying by getting healthy, by going to school, sort of contextualizing the daily activities is something that can help. Exactly, the why, yeah. Without overwhelming the children, of course, and giving them these insurmountable tasks, but creating those moments of actually attaining something and being able to see, yes, I can go through these different steps and grow and achieve some sort of meaning and purpose. Mm-hmm. It can be very difficult for kids to put meaning onto, well, why did my parents die, or why did these people kill them, etc. So I don't mean so much in that sense, but kind of having something bigger to strive towards and things to look forward to. In cases of children who lost their parents but still had their siblings, that's one way to create meaning of I need to take care of my siblings. That's another type of meaning where it's not necessarily a politically driven kind of thing in the sense of I'm going to rebuild a country, but let's rebuild my family. Yeah. So again, I can go on for a long time about that, but I think that gives it a little bit of a context.
That's very helpful. I'm just going to maybe repeat the question for Paulina. We're now just speaking, we've got a list of questions, and for the next half hour we'll be having a bit of a discussion. The question was, when people are surviving and then rebuilding their lives, what is the importance, or how do they express a sense of purpose? And now you don't have to answer just yet, because we're going to, Tanya will say something, and then Marcin, so you'll have time to think about this. But just as your travels, your experience with Babcia, how did that come through for them, a sense of purpose that gave them their life strength to continue? Or you could speak about your own experience, of course, because you also have had some personal strengths that you've had to build. So that gives you a few minutes to think, and because now Tanya and Marcin have to answer next.
Well, I don't pretend to have any great specific insight more than Amanda has said about the sort of the psychological challenges of young people finding purpose. But I'm happy to be political because I don't have to not be in my current role, which is a real relief. And one thing that I do notice, I briefly worked in a political context in New Zealand in trying to bring some justice to young children who are kept in refugee camps off in Australian islands. And the inhumanity of the situation that those children find themselves in is kind of hard to even begin to understand. You don't have to have familial experience of dislocation, of refugee camps to understand how heartless that is. And I think one of the big things that is a challenge for those children and in many cases their families is that lack of a future, that lack of purpose, that inability to access your culture, a sense of purpose back home, a sense of future in Australia or elsewhere. New Zealand has tried, as you said, to relocate those children. And you see that expressed in the extreme self-harm in some cases that those children, are putting themselves through, that extremely traumatic levels of mental distress, of suicidal ideation, all of these really awful things. So I think it's on the sort of the negative side, I guess, of what Amanda was speaking to, that in the absence of support, of humanity, of a sense of purpose and opportunity, children understandably lose, the connections to all the things that give them a chance at a good life. And I think that the experience in Australia currently reflects the experience of, millions of children that have gone before them. So I think it's a little bit of our collective duty to think about what more we could do for children who are suffering in those particular circumstances right now.
Thank you. Matthew, do you want to add something to?
Well, I don't really have that experience because no one was sent to Siberia. Babcia moved to Warsaw in '46, but there's a huge gap when it's about the war because she never wanted to talk about the occupation, the German occupation, and now, well, she died quite a few years ago. So yeah, that leaves me with a huge gap that I need to explore.
Fill in your own purpose.
Yes, but yeah, I don't have experiences like that. So
Okay, that's fair.
After when my grandma came back to Poland, the most important support I think was to build up life from the beginning. So she got family, and I think one of the biggest support would be family, to adopt people in a new place. And from my father's side, also the family was deported. He was born in Vilnius. So basically, I was raised as a nomad, I would say, because I've been changing countries all the time since a kid. When I was 4, I had to change. Then when I was 18, I lived in another country, in Italy. Then I was living in Spain. And I think support of surrounding is very important to adopt ourselves into new place. And family, that's what brings roots. That's all what comes to my head. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think the theme also for me for that is to have the relationships, whether it's with Father Lucian or with Stanisław, with the family, in the family, and so on. So that's something that we're, as a foundation, we're building the relationships with the generations that came before us. I won't say anymore. I will pass to Nina Sawicka. You don't have to ask this to Tanya. You can ask it to generally, or you can pick a person to ask the question to.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we should give you the microphone. This will either open the microphone.
Thank you all for your presentations. So I guess this question is probably to Amanda and Tanya. So drawing on this, your finding of this sense of purpose and meaning, and linking that with my father having space to write his memoirs when he reached retirement, and thinking about my father, and this is a question I'd be quite keen to put to you, Amanda, about refugees. He achieved in his post-Siberia life an educational goal which he pursued with absolute passion. Like he studied accountancy and law, and then my vivid memories of him as writing a PhD on the kitchen table while he also held down a full-time job. No computers then, so there were papers scattered all over the dinner table. So that sort of gave him a sense of purpose and meaning, and his overriding drive to us was education was everything. Life was all about education and extending yourself. And when I expressed to him at 16 that I was sort of thinking about doing medicine, I remember him saying to me, you have to make a difference. You have to do something useful with your life. And I think my daughters have been afflicted with the same burden. So,
well, I'm thankful to be sitting beside you.
So I'm curious to hear your perspective as third generation about where refugees, what drove them, whether that experience of my father was common, and what that's been like for third generations.
Thank you. Yes, to keep the answer short, I would say yes, education is something, it's one of the themes that came up a lot in the interviews that I've done, as well as family and being quick to buy a house, settle down. Of course, you could do that a lot easier back then than you can now. For the millennial generation, it's a little bit more difficult to do that. But definitely education, get a home, create a family, get some sort of normal life back on track, but then also, and this is where the sense of purpose and meaning comes in, to make something with the life that you have. And that was easier for some and more difficult for others, because again, when there would be a lot of, let's say, mental illness or difficulty dealing with the trauma, it doesn't really matter how much motivation we may have. There are things that will pull us down and make it so much more difficult to achieve the ideals that we set out for ourselves. But absolutely, education and family, two of the highlights that came up in terms of creating a sense of meaning and purpose.
I won't go into the personal family dynamics that my mother has into that. There's a lot to unpack there. But I think it is interesting to me to reflect on the differences between experience that many migrant families share about the importance of education and some of the things that Amanda spoke to, the importance of putting down roots, of building family, of accessing education, of bettering yourself. And I think there is some interesting work there to pass out what is different, what is specific about refugee experience that's perhaps a kind of a lens additional to the migrant experience. What about that understanding of the fragility of life, or that sense of needing to find purpose and needing to give back, the degree to which that's specific to those who have experiences as refugees. But I certainly think that's a common theme in the little research I have done in this area, that is a common theme of refugee diaspora, not just in New Zealand, not just for the Saviskis either.
Okay. Will we go to the next question then? Which is you, Maciej. You're holding the microphone.
To ja po polsku może zadam pytanie.
Well, ask my question in Polish.
Okay, I can in English also. First question to Tania, because I'm lost during your talk. What's the way your grandfather way from Poland when he was born to New Zealand where he died? What's the route? And together, Tania and Amanda, a question: do you feel sometimes alone as you dig your family history? You try to know, because in Poland, I sometimes in my family I feel alone, that I'm interested in history of my family, and it's my hobby. So, what's your experience in New Zealand and in Canada?
Well, I'll be brief. My family is very specific in that my mother's sister, my aunt, actually wrote a book about Polish history with my grandfather. And so there was a great degree of interest, I think, in our family about our history of the Polish nation, as well as the familial history. So I don't feel alone in pursuing that, although I do think that, I was just saying earlier, I hadn't made the connection between my family's history and the history of the Pahiatua children, and that's something that I think is a connection I'd like to know more about. But yeah, it's, I think where where there is a bit of a sense of loneliness has been in not feeling part of that big story, because Stan's story is quite specific, and he came alone with his children, and the family that remains are now really mostly in France. So I think that's one real wonderful experience that we have through Kredzi Siberia, is being able to connect to people, and so not feeling so lonely in the New Zealand context, because have friends across the world. I'll just briefly tell you a bit about Stan's story that I skipped over or perhaps spoke too fast about. So after he was released from the Gulag, he, like many others, made his way overland through Persia.
And what happened after when a war started?
Yeah, so he joined the British Air Force in Palestine, and fought with, I think he was a navigator. He was a navigator with the Polish Air Corps that were part of the British Army, and so that led him to England, where he was able to finish his education. And then he lived in England. He met my grandmother. They lived there for 15 years. And then they travelled to Australia. Hated Australia, sorry. At the time, as my mother mentioned earlier, he had a great fear and, I guess, repulsion of police, and there was a lot of corruption in Australia in the 1970s, in Victoria and in Queensland.
It was founded by prisoners.
Yeah. So they wanted to leave Australia, and on the way back to England, they actually went via New Zealand. That's the way that the ships went at that time. And it was through this chance meeting when they got off the ship for a day or two that he met an old colleague in Wellington and was offered a job there. So he ended up staying in New Zealand. Yeah, that's how we got there. It's very circuitous.
Okay.
So I still feel lonely sometimes, and that's okay, because sometimes when we're doing something that's really unique, we won't necessarily have people to connect with on every single element of what we're doing. And I think it's important that we find overlapping ways to connect with each other. There are ways that we all connect with each other, but also ways that we're all not connected with each other. There are certain things in our lives, in our family histories, in our respective types of research and hobbies that make what we do unique. And I think that's okay. But definitely, when I was growing up, I didn't feel so lonely about it within my family, because we talked about it quite openly. We talked more about the Africa times than about the Gulag times. But definitely there were times when I wouldn't finish my food, and my grandparents will say, in Siberia we only had fish eye soup and 200 grams of bread. So I grew up with those sorts of stories. There was that.
Eat your food.
Exactly, yeah. I did develop a little habit of saving a bit of food in my room from time to time for about a month.
Bread under the bed? Oh, no.
Yeah, I would say that some of the loneliness that I felt was actually in an academic context. When I first started really diving into this research, there were professors who said, you can't do this. It's too difficult, or there aren't the resources for it. And I mean, thankfully we found each other when I started this work. That was an excellent resource. So yeah, we have overlapping communities that keep us feeling less lonely.
Paulina, Marcin, do you want to say anything about looking for the community or making the connections? If you're both explorers and you're around the world, but do you have a perspective on making the connections with people?
Community. Actually, I will start the story how I'm here, because I just had an idea to go to Siberia, and I started to make research, and I found a fan page of this foundation. And I just post a picture. I have a plan to go to Siberia. Do you guys know anywhere there who can connect me to people which were deported to Siberia? And that's how we spoke, and that's how I ended up being here. And that's usually how I make connection in a very easy way. Or I go to Toastmasters, or I attended a charity organization of a Rotaract Club for many years. I attend any events with digital nomads back in Bali, where I used to live. Or I just explore prayers of local people, go to any institution, keep talking to them and ask questions. So I find that very easy. Because I'm a nomad, and I think I was raised like that. My father says I had to be surrounded always with all kind of people and foreigners. And since I was kid in London, we changed 3 houses. In Poland, we changed 5 places to live. So I had to adopt myself very fast to change surrounding, and also for my health reasons also I had to adopt myself for different lifestyle as a healthy person and then with some health issues. So I think it's inside me, and I have this capacity because I was raised like that and life dropped me there.
Okay.
Well, I guess it's all about connections. You never know where it will take you. I mean, it was a couple of years ago when I started typing in those names from Red Cross lists from Africa, and here I am now sitting on the hot chair. But I guess it's really simple things. Some time ago I used to like make my own T-shirts and sell them on eBay, and I made a T-shirt with it was a picture from North Africa with the SAS, or the Long Range Group, and I was contacted by a guy who said, oh, actually the third guy is my grandfather, and he asked me, well, if I would mind stop selling it. But then from that we started emailing, and then he gave me a lot of resources. So it's just really a simple chat can lead you
talking to other people.
Exactly.
You know, I was going to also just draw the thread together, Maciej, to answer your question, and we'll go to Mark, which is many people who have joined Crisis Siberia on the chat groups or in the virtual museum or coming to the conferences have said, I always felt alone with my history, but now I feel like I've joined a family. This is a second family for me. And it's quite interesting how often that has happened. And for me, part of the lesson is maybe inside your community or family, you might be the only one with this interest, but now we're all here together. And for years we've been doing this, and new people are coming in, and it is like a family. And we don't have to be alone, because we can share and support each other. And you know, I think that's a very exciting thing about
we're here for you, Maciej.
And about meeting together. Yes, exactly. Can we pass to Marek?
3 hugs later.
Thank you very much.
All right. In that case, we'll skip ahead to Maria. But you should take the microphone. Maciej, for Maria, please. Thanks.
I wonder if Amanda could say a few words about epigenetics. Because when the topic was mentioned on Crisis Siberia site, stories came pouring out on how the genes of the parents who have been traumatized are passed on to the children, not just the environment, but actually genetic changes occur. And many people had stories to tell about that.
Okay.
I will answer with a not answer and say that a lot of what ends up being written on that topic and other topics for sort of mass consumption, so published in various online journals, not academic journals, but in articles that can easily be shared, often miss a lot, for obvious reasons, miss a lot of the dense science behind it. So sometimes there will be research done with clinical populations. So for example, research that's done with a group of Holocaust survivors who have been diagnosed with depression and treated for years. And there are 30 of those, and then you study their children and grandchildren. Well, that is a very specific group. But then those results will be written into articles that are shared as your grandmother's trauma will ruin your life. And you think, okay, well, way to make a mountain out of a molehill. So I am not an expert in epigenetics. I know there's a lot of research floating around on that topic, and I think it's important that research be done with diverse populations on that topic. but we should also be careful to jump to the conclusion and say, oh, well, I'm this way because of that, because it's not necessarily, and it could be that there are certain personality traits or reactions to things that grandchildren will have that could have been affected by grandparents' experiences from a social perspective rather than a genetic perspective as well, right? So it's a big Pandora's box that we're just starting to unpack, but as a public service announcement, be careful when reading those articles. It probably doesn't actually correspond with your experience. It's not that simple, and the deep science behind it is
It's just
very
I
particular.
understand that actual genes were examined.
Exactly,
Yeah,
but they were examined in a specific group of people who had a very particular experience living in a certain region, and it just goes on and on and on.
So
but it's something to explore, for sure.
Okay, Ivana, you have the microphone next, if we can pass to Ivana. And
Hello.
I'll just note that we have 6 minutes until the coffee break, so if anyone else had a question, I'll call just for a show of hands now. One, oh my goodness, okay, I see Anna.
Right, I'll keep mine to half a minute.
Oh, good, we have 11 minutes, so
Right.
just a moment, before you start, I just wanted to write down the next people so that I've got myself organized. So I saw Anna's hand go up, I saw Joanna, and I saw Irena, and I think I saw Adam. Okay.
I mean, unless people are okay with cutting into the coffee break a little bit, that's also a possibility.
Of course we could. Now, the other thing I was going to say as a public service announcement is cutting into the coffee break. Before we went to get coffee, we wanted to have everybody come to the stage, and our official photographer, Greg, will set us up for a group photograph. So don't go to the bathroom until after we've had the photograph. Ivana.
Right, here we go. This pertains to all of you here and also to Jonathan. Just a bit of information. On prime time, 6 o'clock news on the BBC in England, there was a series of programs, and Basha, you can correct me if I make any mistakes, called Nationwide. And it was in the mid-1980s because my son was born in 1983, so I think it could have happened 85. And the title was, of this series of programs, Refugees. And they had refugees, as far as I can remember, from India and Pakistan. I don't know where the second refugee group came, but the third refugee was Poles. And in this case, it was my mother, who was a Mocha Ochotniczka. She was deported to Western Russia and Siberia, ended up in Palestine, and with her brothers and my grandmother, they were in the cadet schools, Szkoły Junackie, in the cadet schools for the boys and in the cadet schools for the girls. Now, at that time, I was a rising musician, but a young mother, and one of the things I was involved in was in, you talked earlier on about a sense of community, and as many of you know, people sang, they danced, they formed choirs, they formed clubs, and in London at the time, there was a choir set up, not by me, of these refugees, of these people who'd been in Siberia, and they sang a lot of the Polish traditional songs and all kinds of other songs. Anyway, there was quite a well-known presenter called Valerie Singleton who came to our house and interviewed my mother. Then they went to the Polish Centre, which was just being built in London, Posk, and again they filmed the choir, and other things went on which I can't remember. I happen to have a copy of this whole programme, the series of this programme. If you wanted to use it for any form of research, I'm sure that I can...
Is it online? You can send us a link?
No idea, because... sorry? It could well be on YouTube.
Good. Well, let's put it on our page and people can refer to it.
Yeah, I mean, it'll give you many references. So.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll continue moving along then to Anna. If you could pass the microphone, Ivana, down to Anna.
Sorry?
Microphone that way. Thank you. It's like a talking stick. You can only talk when you're holding the microphone.
Hi, this follows a little on epigenetics, but not really. As a child, I always felt a sense of sort of not being connected, or a sense of loss, or a sense of something. And it's when I came here that I realized that it is a sense of loss. And it seems that now there's a lot of people, the children and grandchildren of the, the people that were transported to Siberia and their whole experience, that, we're looking for something, we're looking for answers, we're looking for sort of our place that we lost somewhere along the way. And I'm wondering if this is something that maybe is something that has been passed on from our parents, not by genetics, but simply because of maybe hearing or not hearing their stories, but always having that sort of sense that there was something there that was taken away. Or so is it a possibility that this is something that we are feeling? That maybe that's
and why are we looking, and what are we looking for?
Why are we looking so hard? Yeah, and could I have felt this way because of that something was, now that I'm here, I realize something has been taken away.
So basically I was meeting all the shamans for that fact in Siberia, and for past 2 years I've been doing this healing journey because I also felt that way. And in a shamanic culture they say that we are connected to all the roots and all the ancestors. So my journey ended up being in all the places where my ancestors were. So I was there praying and thinking about them. And when I came back after 2 years of traveling, I feel fully integrated with myself. So there is something about that, what you mentioned. And I encourage people to just travel more and see where our ancestors were. Like, for example, I went to Vilnius, where my father was born, where his family come from, like each place from like 2 generations. I tried to find out. So yeah, we are fully connected, spirituality, with our spirits. We are part of them, so that's how it works.
Oh.
I'll just briefly say one interesting thing for me that has come up a lot in this is that in New Zealand there has been a real effort more recently for Pākehā, so British, European New Zealanders, to connect with what Māori, who are the indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand, call their whakapapa, which is basically your lineage, your heritage, and the whenua, the land that you come from. And it's something that if you introduce yourself in a setting like this, you would do your pepeha and you would say, I'm Tanya, this is where my ancestors are from, this is the land that I come from, this is my mountain, this is my river, this is my sea. And in trying to write that for myself in my work, in context where I needed to introduce myself with a pepeha, I realized that I didn't know a lot about where my grandparents had come from and what my ancestry was. So I think for me, I really connect with what you're saying in terms of trying to find meaning and understanding better the journey of your ancestors, where they come from, and I guess tracing that lineage is something that's very it's very necessary, I think, to feel connected to who you are in a way. And that's something that I think many Indigenous cultures have understood for a very long time. Perhaps those of us who have, been distanced from our communities are maybe taking a slightly longer time to come to terms with. But I think certainly from what I've felt in talking to many people here today, that is something that actually remains very important for a lot of people.
Okay, I'm going to see if we can move through the questions again, because Maciej, how much time do we have before the coffee gets cold? 3 questions. Joanna.
Well, so mine is not as much a question as a comment. And you guys were talking about loneliness. I wouldn't say that that's what I'm directing myself to, but yesterday, when I saw Aita and we found out we both jumped on crocodiles, I said, how many people can you tell that to? You absolutely can't. If you tell people that, they'll take you away, and So I said, for the first time in my life, I could talk about jumping on crocodiles, I could also talk about hippopotamus invading my house, and someone understood that. No one who hasn't had that experience can understand that. So as a sense of family, this is wonderful, and I won't talk about it because I cry a lot.
Oh.
And then the second thing I was going to say, my mother grew up in Lviv, and getting to know Lviv so intimately yesterday was amazing. And I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for coming all the way from the U.S. to be with us and represent the generations. Irenalo. Microphone. You can't speak. That's the talking stick. Okay.
Hi. I'm the other one from New Zealand. This is the third time I've been to a Kresa Siberia conference in Warsaw, and it's always been an amazing experience. Now, I was thinking back at purpose, and I just remembered a story my mum told me. My mum is a Siberiak. She lives in New Zealand. She's about to turn 90. And she came out to Iran. She was on her own. My grandfather joined the army. My grandmother eventually died in Uzbekistan. And she was quite sick, and she was in hospital, and there was no one around her. She had no one, and she felt really, really low. And she said she was just ready to die. She was just ready to let life go. And it must have been early. It must probably maybe October 1942. And she said a woman came out from her children's camp from Uzbekistan, came looking for her, and she found her, and she says, "Oh, look, we're going to Africa tomorrow. You know, I want to take you. And she said, just that one person coming to her, wanting her, wanting to find her. There was someone. And but she didn't go to Africa because she got sick and they kept her in hospital, and eventually she came to New Zealand. Anyhow, all the stories have been fantastic, and that feeling of connection with Kresa Siberia, with anyone with these stories. And I have a little group I started up in New Zealand, mainly women, but occasionally we get a guy come along, and we all have this kind of Siberian or some kind of a Polish connection. And it's just like when we're together, everything just sort of happens naturally. We understand each other. The other point I just wanted to make was that not having, being alone, many families didn't have other family members with them. It meant that you made family connections with other similar families, and that's my growing up in New Zealand. No uncles, no aunties, no cousins. And I did have a grandfather, and it was those other Polish families, and they're my brothers and sisters. And so I think we were enriched in that way, and yet, we had losses as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we were allowed to have 3 questions by Maciej, and there's only one more question, which is Adam.
Thanks, everyone, for speaking. I was going to ask kind of a dry methodological question to Amanda, but I think I'll talk to you later about that, so I don't bore anyone. So I think I just have a comment. I just finished doing research on 2nd and 3rd generations of deportees. It was structured more at looking of historical narratives of Kresa, which are pretty intertwined with the deportations, with Siberia, with places like Africa, which are seemingly have no connection to it. But I guess my comment is, it was touched on throughout the conference, but I would really stress the role that the internet is playing in all this. We were talking about the people have been scattered around the world, the different artifacts, the archives have been scattered, the stories, the memories, so on and so forth. It's really difficult to get all those physical things in one place. And even though Białystok Museum sounds amazing, in my opinion, museums are becoming a little anachronistic, at least physical museums. For someone who loves museums, I see this as a problem, not as a good thing, but I think this is really the perfect medium to do it, because you can post these stories, people can have this sense of community, they can educate one another, they could speak. So for me, it was, I was looking at people who were 2nd and 3rd generation from Kresa, so actually thanks to Kresa Siberia group, identifying my sample was pretty easy. So I just went, I just went there and I drew from that. So I would say, Yeah, especially with, I wanted to say yesterday too, there was a study in 2012 by CBOS, which is Centrum Badania Opinii Społecznej in Poland. And they stated that 1 in 7 people in Poland today trace their lineage back to Kresy. Yeah, so that's 1 in 7, and that's just people that they know. So now imagine in the US, in Canada, in New Zealand, that's 1 out of 100,000, I don't know. So yeah, I'm convinced that the internet is really, at least right now, the only way that this can happen. This might be considered an interesting subgroup, since they've traveled all this way to be here, but because of this, we really have connections from around the world, from New Zealand, from Iran, and so on. So.
And of course, we're multi-channel, because there's the audience out there in the internet who's participating by extension what we're doing here as a critical mass of relationship building as well. On that theme, I will now ask everybody, and Greg, you tell us how you want us to do this, because I reckon there might be 3 rows of 8 or something. Greg is going to organize us. Some people will be sitting, some will be standing.
If anyone wants movies, I give it, yes, to you for your research, because...
Yes, and we can then distribute it. And again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you very much. If we can organize ourselves quickly for this photograph. Greg, how do you want us to go?